The Bob Murphy Show, episode 159.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, on this episode, I'm going to be talking with Gregory Gordon, and we're going to be just working through some issues that I've been thinking a lot about myself. So there's no real agenda. It's not like I had the conclusions already set and want to just communicate them to you. We really are just having a conversation and trying to work through some stuff. So specifically, Gregory had written an article for Mises.org talking about the left and right and how that relates to libertarianism. And like I say, it just intersected with a lot of stuff. In particular, some of you may have heard of Michael Malus's test that I think is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but you never know with that guy, where he says, if you ask a person a question and say, are some people better than others? Someone who's from the right will say yes, and someone from the left will give you a speech. And then so Malus says this is a surefire way of separating those who are on the left and the right. And so Gregor and I talk about that stuff. A little bit about his background. Gregory Gordon works as a geoscientist in the petroleum industry, and he is a lecturer in the California State University system. He earned his PhD in geology from the Colorado School of Mines. In addition to applied science and the philosophy of science, he has interests in politics, political philosophy, American history, and Austrian economics. Gregory has written articles for Mises.org, the Libertarian Republic, American Thinker, and various geological journals and publications. He lives in California with his wife and 4 children. And his Twitter handle is at Gregory S. Gordon. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Gregory Gordon on the left and right and libertarianism. Well, Greg, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks very much, Bob. Glad to be here.
So as I talk to the listeners in my formal introduction that you haven't heard yet, we're going to be going through this Mises.org article that you wrote that, as I was chatting with you before the interview started, you hit like at least 3 separate things that I'd been musing about. And so I thought this was a great opportunity just to flesh that stuff out, talking with you. But before we dive into that, can you just give some brief background about, your educational path and like how did you come to get into this wacky world of Austro-libertarianism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up between California and Texas. I'm a Californian now, living back here in California's Central Valley. And my educational background is in earth sciences, geology. And I work as an applied geoscientist in the oil and energy industry. And that's a whole other issue that, it's a fascinating issue with fracking and economics and what's going on here in California. But I've always been interested in politics, political philosophy. My whole family's been into that sort of thing. And I've always been a free marketeer and a capitalist at heart. And I kind of got drawn into the Austrian world. My interest there really started with, I think, Hayek, who's very accessible, I believe, to people more on the right, people coming from the conservative realm. Hayek is a great communicator and kind of the intro pill into Austro-libertarianism. And then, of course, you can get into everything, Mises, and then, of course, Rothbard. And for many like me, I have a great interest in Hoppe. And so I've always been interested in politics and political philosophy in particular. And from time to time, I write articles. Not only in geosciences, but also in politics, sometimes current events and that sort of thing here and there. I'm trying to put one together right now, actually, on Lockean proviso and the Blockian proviso and natural resources, public property, public property as such. But at one point in time, I had a small radio show on the weekends here in the Central Valley. That was fun while it lasted. And I've always kind of dabbled here and there. But I try to follow things pretty closely, and like many maybe in our community or this part of the world, I've been watching the Libertarian, capital L party, for the past long while, and I've been looking at electoral politics. I follow the red versus blue stuff as well, And I had some thoughts about that. A lot of great discussions recently on several of the podcasts that I enjoy listening to. And I thought, here's maybe something where I could kind of throw my hat into the ring, add a couple of ideas.
Okay, great. Incidentally, I don't know, are you aware of who Rob Bradley is? Does that name mean anything to you?
I don't know Rob Bradley.
Okay, yeah. So I'll send you the link after the show, and folks, just so you know too, he was on. I interviewed him on the Bob Murphy show. I don't remember the episode number off the top of my head, but he was one of the few people that got a PhD with Rothbard as his dissertation chair. Rob wasn't at UNLV.
At UNLV?
No, he was somewhere else, but like Rob's program allowed you to have somebody else be your chair. And it was on like oil economics, oil and natural gas, and with a focus on the interventions in the 1970s. But Rob also has developed an Austrian theory of resource ship, like things like, if there's a deposit of oil underground that covers several people's land, how do they determine? One guy drills down and he drains it all as he's stealing from his neighbor. That kind of stuff.
Right.
And Rob came up with a theory for that. So anyway, I'll send you that stuff in case.
I'd love to see that. That's fascinating. I think there's a lot of fertile ground there, and particularly in California with what's going on right now in Sacramento with Newsom and everything.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so, but the focus of today's talk or interview is your recent article at Mises.org, Why There's a Left-Right Divide Among Libertarians. And of course, folks, so this is bobmurphyshow.com/159. We'll give you links to this article and other things we might touch upon. And I'm not going to just read the whole thing and have you comment on section, even though I actually, Greg, just so you know, because your thing is so succinct and spot on to the things I wanted to discuss, I actually considered just going through and reading a few paragraphs and then saying discuss, and then we go, but because I don't want to miss them. But anyway, I think that would get tedious for the listener who can't see it. But let me just read the opening bit, and then we'll jump in. So this is your article. Amid the socio-cultural convulsions and boutique displays of urban anarcho-tyranny that have taken place in America in recent months, there's been renewed discussion within certain circles of the liberty movement about how appropriate it is for libertarians and their intellectual brethren to self-identify as right-wing or left-wing. While libertarianism itself, which merely requires adherence to the non-aggression principle, or NAP, and a desire to minimize or abolish state power, need not be considered right-wing or left-wing political philosophy, I contend, from a decidedly right-wing perspective, that individual libertarians are almost certainly on the right or on the left. Okay, so let me just summarize. So you're saying there, as I take it, that it's true, libertarianism per se, like the definition of what does it mean to be a libertarian in your book, is simply endorsement of the non-aggression principle, which I guess for newcomers, saying it is immoral to initiate force or fraud against someone else. And so you're saying that's the definition, but yet you're saying in practice, you show me someone who calls him or herself a libertarian, and I bet you that person's clearly either on the right or on the left or coming out of that tradition.
Correct.
Okay. And the reason,
right. Yeah, absolutely.
And just one more thing, and then I will stop talking. Partly why you're stressing that is because it's fashionable among certain self-identified libertarians to say, oh, we're above that. The rabble out there, the idiots who watch CNN and Fox, they sort themselves according to left versus right. But we libertarians are beyond that. We know that there isn't a left-right spectrum.
Above the fray.
Yeah.
Right.
And then,
right, absolutely.
And in fact, okay, so go ahead. That's enough of an intro. So do you want to expound on that?
Sure, we can talk to that first point. I think a lot of people that we probably, I would imagine we both respect quite a bit. I'm thinking even folks like Walter Block and whatnot. I believe their position, and I want to do it justice, but I think they think of libertarianism as perhaps the third leg of the stool. I've heard that, thrown around with lots of people, not just Dr. Block. But, that is definitely one area where I would kind of disagree. And I think that what we have to do is look at libertarianism broadly as an overarching but relatively thin philosophy. Libertarianism itself is a relatively limited philosophy. When we look at individuals, they have certain ideas about morality, about ethics, natural rights, the relationship between the state and civil society. And really, again, if we kind of sublimate or we come back out to the shell or the outer boundary of libertarianism. It really, in my view, is more concerned with what is the nature of the state, that there should either be no state or a very, very minimal government, right? And then the non-aggression principle. And if we kind of set those, or if we agree that those are the defining kind of base level requirements for defining libertarianism, then you can have a broad variety of different views and ethical worldviews, even metaphysical worldviews within libertarianism. So I think it's a relatively limited philosophy, certain as far as ethics. It definitely is ethically, I would argue. Because when people try to apply libertarianism to their own lives, it can be preposterous. We don't run our households, I would imagine, many of us, as a libertarian, or many of us even as egalitarians, but maybe that's a separate issue within our households. Libertarianism really, as I see it, in my view, what I argue for is that it really only applies to the state or external coercive power of government. And hence, it's not sufficient to describe everything that happens within human society, civil society, and our lives, certainly with our ethics, metaphysics, and what have you. And again, I think some people do want to see it as it's another player in the game. There's the right, there's the left, and there's this new portion of a political quadrant or political compass. And that's libertarianism. It's either above the fray or it's just separate and distinct from the fray. And that's where I would disagree. And I kind of went into that a little bit in this broad article.
Okay, so this one thing you just said there almost as an offhand remark, but I want to just see if we have an actual disagreement about how we use the term, or when you were saying you wouldn't run your household, and you think a lot of the listeners wouldn't, according to a libertarian method, right?
Sure.
Okay. So but at the same time, I don't think you believe that, so when like, your kid mouths off and you say, okay, go to your room, that you're initiating aggression against your kid, right? Or that you're violating property rights.
Sure. I guess all I'm saying is that in my household, personally, we run it maybe a little bit more what people might tongue-in-cheek say, that's more of a socialistic or a paternalistic or maternalistic society that the Gordon household is, because I care for my children. It is, to a certain extent, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, with small children, with infants and your children that you love. You bring them into your home, you either adopt or have children and whatnot, and you care for them within your house. So certainly we don't apply, or some of us don't apply, libertarian principles to even within the household, doing chores, domestic work, everyone either paying rent or that sort of thing. So I guess I'm just drawing the distinction that not involving the non-aggression principle so much, but within our homes, we have very different ethical systems. That libertarianism itself is best applied to governmental relations, societal relations, is my position.
Okay. Let me just push one more time, just because since we are talking about like the definition and how people use it and whatever, that's why I just want to make sure we're clear on how we're using it. So the way I would typically use these terms is I would say somebody who, gives their 10-year-old food, even though the kid didn't do any chores, I wouldn't say, that's actually communism. I would say, no, that's consistent with libertarianism and private property because I'm the owner and I can go ahead and do. So I think maybe the way I would get at what and not the one's right or wrong, but just so the listeners don't get confused about, at least where I'm coming, is I would say libertarianism is a pretty weak criterion. Like that doesn't give you everything you need. So like I'm a Christian, libertarian ethics is not enough for me to know how to live my life. So it's a bare minimum. Like, I shouldn't go initiate aggression, but I need to know more than that. I need to know the Sermon on the Mount to know what should I go do. Libertarianism is kind of just like a constraint saying you can't do this.
Sure, absolutely. Okay. And just to be clear here too, from in that regard to that offhanded comment, I don't run my household as some kind of communistic authoritarian regime.
Right.
But yeah, exactly. libertarianism is very important, certainly, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah, okay.
In my view, as a Christian as well as a Catholic.
Okay, so what is wrong with the? All right, let's do it this way. Why don't you explain what do you mean? So someone's a libertarian, self-identified, and
Sure.
even if they say, "Oh no, we're above the free," because it's funny. Like with Walter Block, I mean, I think most people would say he's clearly from the right. Like just listen to him give a talk. He's totally from the right. You know, he
Sure.
relishes offending people, like using risque example thought experiments to startle people. And so, and of course, you know, he's for multi-billionaires, you know, existing side by side with people of modest means and so on. So, he's a right winger.
Sure.
He thinks people can does he think people can voluntarily sell themselves into slavery? I think that's his position. I know he argues with people. I can't remember which side he comes down, but
he might have made that argument. Yeah.
But so, okay. So, but then again, he's also with evictionism. So he is tricky to put in a box. But your claim
the abortion,
is,
that's a fascinating one as well.
Yeah.
The abortion discussion. But
okay.
Go ahead.
So you're saying in general, you think people can be put sorted as either right wing or left wing. So can you just loosely speaking, what do you mean by those terms?
Sure. So yes, libertarianism itself does not have to be right wing or left wing, in my view. But when we get into the practical world of real life human beings, actual human beings moving around, you know, deciding upon things with human action, interacting with one another with scarce resources, when it all plays out, the way I see it is that people still divide out on the right or on the left. And so what does that mean? Of course, these are very loaded terms. You know, they began in the 18th century, around the time of course, the French Revolution. They were literal descriptions. Are you sitting on the left side or the right side of the assembly and whatnot? And they really took off after that. But I think people use them in different ways. So for the point of the article and the way that I would employ it is that being on the right side of things would imply nothing even politically yet. We don't even need to get into that. Certainly not red state, blue state politics. What it really implies is that you believe in natural hierarchies. And what I mean by that is that natural hierarchies that arise in human society, are not necessarily unjust. And they're not necessarily to be squelched down and stamped out, certainly. Many on the right believe in some kind of objective natural order. Many, but not all, I want to be fair. Certainly there are natural rights libertarians who believe that rights are innate, the rights that we're born with. They're inherent to us. Now, I realize that a lot of conservatives or those on the right, even Edward Burke and Burkeans, might see natural rights as being prone to causing revolutions and upheaval in society. That really forget about where the rights actually come from. And I don't know if they'd say forget about it, but they'd say that our rights are inherited as Englishmen or as Americans or whatnot. They're inherited through a tradition, whether it's common law or, you know, Magna Carta, constitutional allowances or what have you. But nonetheless, most on the right, I believe, do believe in some kind of objective moral order. And again, there are some consequentialists and utilitarians, and I understand that. I respect their position. Contrasting that with those on the left, as I see it, there's much more of a value placed on egalitarianism. These days, we hear more about equity, fairness, even equal opportunity to some extent, certainly equality of outcome and whatnot. And then also on the left, you know, it's okay to have society in a continual state of upheaval, and I don't want to say chaos, but continual change and churn, because there's always this drive to protect the rights of the oppressed, whoever that might be. And that might change at any given time. And we might have this discussion, this argument back and forth, this dialectic about what should be done, how these injustices should be reconciled or rectified. And that's a big part, I think, of being on the left. It's a drive to shake society up, to get rid of these perceived injustices or imbalances of power.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
I think that's kind of a quick snapshot of how I see the differences between left and right in the article and whatnot.
So while we're talking about that, let me just chime in. I don't want to forget this. train of thought that, tell me how you feel about this. I had thought and again, it's not that I'm trying to come to some conclusion on these things. I just think these are interesting topics, and we'll just, give fodder for the listeners to think about themselves. A while ago, I was trying to pin down, like, what is the fundamental difference between, because you're right, there clearly are, to me, it seems like, people are either on the right or on the left, or that's at least a useful dichotomy that captures a lot. And it seemed to me that one of the things that the people on the right were more concerned about, like, the procedures, and that we're doing things according to principle and the rules. Like in other words, following the rules is the important thing, whereas for the people on the left, the outcome was the important thing. And so,
Right.
and not that it was 100% on one versus the other. So, like, the people on the right, of course, would, other things equal, they don't like people to be poor or whatever, but absolutely not. You can't take
Sure.
from rich people and give it to the poor people, because that's wrong. It's a violation of rights. And likewise, the people on the left,
Right.
it's not that they don't care about property titles. Other things equal, they would prefer not to have to take money from people against their will. But hey, if somebody needs health care and you've got your 6 mansions over there and you don't want to voluntarily give it to them, well, sorry, but that in my book, the guy getting health care trumps, you not having your property rights, your sacrosanct property rights violated. And so, to me, that would seem to be an important distinction in terms, just like the rhetoric and how they argue about stuff. The left just points, look, all these people we can help, and the right's like, no, look, there's the Constitution, or there's, that's my money, or, the government's stealing your stuff.
Right. And it's almost this distinction between deontological or natural rights type libertarianism, where I think more with deontology, it's more about following those rules that you mentioned. It's about ethics being derived from these rules. Christians would say that comes from the Bible, that comes from the Word of God. If you're Catholic, also from the teachings of the church or whatnot. But that's some kind of deontological based natural rights libertarianism. Versus, I think, more often on the left, they tend to be perhaps more pragmatic in their view. And I won't even go to assigning ill will at all. I think, like you're saying, many times there's this drive to kind of even things out for the sake of fairness, or for the sake of some kind of cosmic justice or whatnot, or the whole system, it's racist. Well, if you have the term systemic racism, that implies system, the system has to be changed or torn down. If there's racism pervading all of us, like some kind of transcendental oversoul, it's just in all of us and it's in the system, then that almost requires that something must be done. There's got to be some upheaval. There's got to be some churn, because that must be rectified. And that's particularly true, again, if you don't believe that rights are innate or that rights are natural. If you believe more in positive rights, and I think that many on the left do believe much more in positive civil rights than they're concerned with natural rights. Many of them don't think that natural rights exist at all, right? Mm-hmm. But if you don't believe in natural rights, then it's completely okay. It's completely acceptable to balance out property, to take some from this person and give it to that person or whatnot, or to regulate guns and self-defense and whatnot. If these are not natural and innate, then of course the state has a place to come in and start regulating things, and should, to a certain extent, according to those beliefs. Mm-hmm. But and I think that we're seeing a lot of this tension in libertarianism, in the capital L, the actual party, the LP. I think we're seeing this because people are kind of scratching their heads and saying, well, okay, there is this tension. I think we're all seeing it. I've heard lots of people have these discussions, but why? Because we're all libertarians, right? Mm-hmm. Even lowercase L libertarians. And I'm constantly kind of bemused by this, because it's like, well, isn't this obvious? The reason that there is this tension, the reason that half of, libertarians are always rolling their eyes at the other half, is because many of them are on the right, and they're saying, and they're seeing what either Joe Jorgensen is tweeting about, or what Gary Johnson's saying in a presidential debate, or you've got to force this person to bake this cake, and preposterous examples. Mm-hmm. Half of libertarianism is saying, what are you talking about? And the other half is saying, well, of course, this makes good sense. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of funny how libertarians, or some libertarians, say, I don't know where this tension's coming from. I look at that and I say, that's kind of the natural world. That's the left and the right. We're seeing it manifest itself. We don't even have to call it such. And I know some people will disagree with this, but that's the tension that I'm seeing within the LP currently.
Right. And I think that dovetails nicely with the point I was making, that even among left libertarians and right libertarians, the emphasis on what I'm doing with my political activism or philosophy is, if you're on the left, it's helping traditionally disadvantaged groups, like the people out there that are getting screwed by the system, and it could be because of police brutality, not just like some wishy-washy systemic race, but no, like if the cops are going around beating people up or whatever, or the public schools are horrible in the inner cities. Like, as a libertarian, you can acknowledge that and say, yeah, that's not good, and that has disproportionate or disparate impacts and so forth. And if you want to,
absolutely,
if you say if that's what you mean by systemic racism, all right, but yeah, things like when I don't know if you remember, Greg, when Rand Paul got in trouble a while ago for talking about they were backing him into a corner saying, would you have voted for the civil rights legislation? And and he didn't want to say no, but yet he couldn't say yeah because that was the deal. And so to right libertarians, it's like, yeah, the legislation's clearly illegitimate. You can't interfere with property owners. What are you talking about? You can't. If someone's a racist and doesn't want to hire,
broke up there.
Oh, okay. So talking about the Civil Rights Act and so on, and that, to people, to right libertarians, like, that's a no-brainer. Of course, the federal government can't, force a business owner to accept customers or employees that they don't want. And if the person's a bigot, okay, well, it's not illegal. You can't take someone's property just because you don't like their views. And yet, to the people on the left, they were just horrified. Like, are you kidding me? This is the hill we're going to die on. We're going to go to the barricades talking about how this, so anyway, I could see their perspective, because I grew up as a normal American, and I understand how inconceivable that sounds. Like, what a troglodyte. You're not for the civil rights legislation of the 60s? Are you out of your mind? But
sure.
So again, just like showing the different focus and like the commitment to, no, this is the principle, and what are you talking about?
Absolutely, and that some rights are inviolable, and even when it might sound, I don't want to say preposterous, but when it might sound, like, whoa, what are you talking about there? But I think certainly a right libertarian, or many libertarians, would say, no, people have the freedom of association, people have free speech, people have property rights, and I know that at the end stage, Hoppe and others really boiled everything down, or most things down, to property rights, and I think it's a nice heuristic that makes a lot of sense. But many libertarians would say, no, we've got to really protect this person's freedom of association, even if it's people with views that we find abhorrent or outlandish or, racist or unjust or whatnot.
And just as an offshoot of that, like in our right now with the debates, like it's appalling to me how many people, when it comes to things like mask mandates, think the issue is, well, let's go consult the science. When it's like, no, I don't care what the science says. You can't force businesses to have certain policy. And also there's utilitarian reasons too that I've argued. If you left it up to stores, the few stores in your area that did have a mask policy, the people there would believe in masks and wear them properly. And whereas right now it's the worst of both worlds. That if you are someone who wants to really be careful and have a mask on, you're forced to shop with people who think it's stupid and they just put something on and don't even cover their nose.
Right. Yeah. And instead of forcing the mandate on everybody, versus just a voluntaristic system would be, well, if you're higher risk or have some medical situation or whatnot, please stay home. We encourage that. That's your personal choice. But that's not the world we live in now in 2020 America. We're going to basically apply this mandate to everyone equally. Everyone's going to be punished and is going to stay at home for years on end while the economy is destroyed. And also, you touched on science there. I think that's a key thing. Even coming from the Austro-libertarian tradition, this worship of science drives me nuts. Hayek and others wrote about it. This scientism, this idea, it's positivistic. Positivism that essentially, to boil it down, all knowledge, all realistic or meaningful knowledge, comes from empirical observation or comes from observations of the natural world. Completely leaving behind a priori reasoning and just the faculty of reason itself, deductive logic and whatnot. This has been something that kind of embedded itself in us, or in Western society at least, ever since the Enlightenment or Endarkenment, whichever side of things you come down on. But basically boiling everything down to these scientific principles where we can measure something and we can view and observe something, and that those are the only truths known to man. And that is very much at odds with earlier Western traditions, certainly going back to classical times, the scholastics and whatnot. It's very much at odds with how the West had always perceived how we gain truth and knowledge about the world. And now we have many of our friends or, other people, family members saying, well, science, we believe in science, the little yard signs in this house.
Yep.
We believe that science is real and love is love and tautologies are tautologies or whatever the stupid, it's like a paragraph long.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
It's virtue signaling or whatnot. But the science question in and of itself, I think, is very, very important, because we aren't run by scientific technocrats. That's not what we have. We're supposed to have a republic that Montesquieu and Jefferson wrote about. And that's a whole other interesting topic of the science running our lives. Science telling us everything we need to know about ethics and morality and about the world in general.
And I think, tell me if you disagree, the reason that is folded in and tends to be on the left where people trumpet it. And just for the listeners, let's be clear, it's not that we're admitting, oh yeah, our opponents do have science on their side and what we're saying is unscientific. No. It's just they hold it up the latest fad, whereas as Hayek cautioned. So Hayek wasn't warning about science. He was warning about, as Greg said, scientism, like this elevation, this unwarranted elevation. And so I think it fits in because, like, central planners, what is the deal? They look at society and they say, this is dumb. There's injustice. This is irrational. We're really smart. We're much smarter than other people. Why don't we just redesign society from scratch?
Right.
And so
the capital P planners.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you have that kind of mentality, it makes sense that you would revere science, because you would want to convince your audience that, no, we humans, look at what we can go to the moon. We can split the atom. Look at the computers we've built. Like, look at how much our minds, and if we use science, look at what we can do. So therefore, why don't we come up with a better social system too?
Right. Exactly right. And as an applied scientist, I'm a big fan of science. I believe in it, but I don't believe that it gives us all capital T truth about the universe. Right. Even coming out of the natural law tradition, we can look at truths. We can learn objective things about the universe by employing scientific methods. Absolutely. We can learn even about, if you're a Christian, we can learn bits about God's will, God's plan for the universe by looking at scientific concepts. Absolutely. But there are other truths in the world. There are things that science cannot explain fully. And hence we don't employ science to run our lives. It's a very hollow and it's a pragmatic philosophy at the end of things. To smear your opponent says, well, you don't believe science is real. Well, that's just not true at all. Remember some of the horrors that science and the planners have given us. Not only eugenics, that's very scientific. And I don't mean it's scientific scientism. It's scientistic. Even going back to the Enlightenment, some of those thinkers were racist in their own way. Voltaire and some of those folks. And so we want to be careful. All that is scientific does not mean it's good or ethical or whatnot. But to be clear, we're not arguing against science. It's more the abuse of science or the worship of science as bringing all truth to the human realm.
Right, and also just to continue on this, it's really Neil deGrasse Tyson tweeted something out the other day that really I found obnoxious, along the lines of for anti-vaxxers, climate deniers, not anti-mask people, and others who deny science, something like that, and blah 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 blah. And what was annoying is for each of those things, like if some mom who is anti, and I'm not here taking a stand on that one way there, but they don't say, oh, I don't care what those Harvard MDs say. I know vaccines are bad because I'm a witch or something, and my spidey sense. No, they will go and point to published literature and say, look, they did this study and this. Maybe they're wrong. Sure. Maybe they don't know how to parse the medical journals and stuff, but they don't say, oh, you're using science to talk about vaccines. I'm going to use religion, or so. That's not what they're doing.
Right.
And certainly in the climate change debate, they're also not throwing out, they're making scientific art, and they're pointing to PhDs, Richard Lindzen and whatnot.
Sure.
So that it's really annoying how the people on the left will say, "Oh, we've got science and you've got nothing."
Right.
So
right, and many of the proponents of scientism, even Neil deGrasse Tyson, Lawrence Krauss, if you actually read what they're saying, beyond just the polemic screeds that they're throwing out all the time to just needle people, but they're not trained at all in, well, a priori reasoning or even argumentation. And so it's a constant stream of straw men and logical fallacies and argumentation from authority. Well, I'm science. It's been set up that way. They're on the altar. They're a scientist. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson. I can't be wrong. But the guy's embarrassingly wrong about things all the time.
Yeah.
People from the scientism realm, look at Paul Ehrlich, famously. He blew everything economically and in terms of looking at, there'll be famines in the 1980s. And these planners, the practitioners of scientism, they think they've got the world all figured out. And then you compare their empirical results later, oftentimes they're embarrassingly wrong. But it's too late. We've already gone way beyond proving them wrong or having them address their own records.
Right. And what's funny, too, is a lot of people say, well, they raised important questions. And it's like, well, no, I thought the criterion for truth was empirical verification, according to you guys. And so it shouldn't.
It's like a Hegelian dialectic, right? Well, they're raising questions. They don't have to be right. We're just having this give and this take, right? It's the march of history.
Yeah.
It's baloney.
Okay. So I want to circle back, if I can, Greg. You mentioned that these labels, left, right, where that came from was the roughly, the time of the French Revolution, and where people in the legislature or the assembly sat.
The assembly, yeah. Does a monarch have the absolute right to veto legislation or whatnot, or can the monarch be overridden, basically?
And so here, this is my whatever high school AP history class kind of loose remembering, but generally speaking, the idea was, so the people on the right were in favor of the tradition, the aristocracy, the way things had been, the ancient regime.
The church.
Yeah. Whereas the people on the left were more of like rationalists and like, the rights of, and so this is why I was going to bring it, because like Thomas Paine famously wrote The Rights of Man as a vindication of the French Revolution, using deductive reasoning, like looking at the essence of man and the nature of things in a deistic framework. And, why would we be subject to a hereditary monarchy? That's the stupidest thing, how could you dream up a system like that? And so, and that term liberal, so like Mises famously considered himself a liberal, like Guido Hulsmann's book's The Last Night of Liberalism. Now we put the adjective, classical in front of it so we don't get confused. But I mean, back then, if you or I were in France, like at the time of Bastiat or J.B. Say or whatever, I think at least economically, our views would be considered very liberal, because we would say, we get rid of the restrictions, let people, enter whatever occupation. If let imports come in, and people would say, but that'll lead to upheaval. Look at the establishment. We'd say, I don't care. It's the rights. You don't have the right to keep out foreign grain or whatever.
Sure.
So I guess, can you speak to like, what is it is it just that, the left has gone so far, now they've gone, the pendulum swung too far, or is there something qualitatively different from the 19th to the 20th century?
Yeah, and I think also we got to keep in mind that to a certain extent, these terms are relative, right? They're relative to the society. If you and I were living in, say, modern day Iran or some ancient totalitarian society or whatnot, or if we were in Cuba, ironically, we would probably be considered, to a certain extent, left-wingers. Maybe Cuba's a muddled example because it has communism or whatnot. But if we lived in some kind of theocratic regime where gays were, reportedly abused or jailed or whatnot, I think both you and I would probably be considered on the left, because these terms do have a little bit of, it's relative to the society in which we live. That's absolutely valid. That's a good point. But I think bringing it back to the French Revolution, we think about Rousseau, who was kind of like the intellectual godfather of that revolution. Well, he had very left-wing views about the nature of man, about human nature, and that humans really could reach their full potential, they come out of a state of nature. It sounds familiar, right? It's kind of Lockean, but they come out of this state of nature where maybe they were more in danger. They come together to form this body politic. They come together, and when they come together, there's this general will, which is almost like the oversoul or the pervasive soul of the people coming together, which can draw out their creativity. It can draw out and create space for their liberties and whatnot. But when you look at it, maybe someone from the right would say, whoa, this is a misunderstanding of human nature, as far as humans are generally good and they're corrupted by their by conditions that they find themselves in. So a lot of people on the right would have an issue with that. And then certainly on the modern right, they would say, this kind of sounds like some totalitarian state, coming together. We all have one general will when we come together. And that's where we can find our maximum flourishing. It's only together when we root out all of the old injustices. And of course, this is why the Bolsheviks really were fascinated by the Jacobins and some of the real thought leaders, or the foot soldiers of the later French Revolution, and even Rousseau early on, before the revolution really got cranked up. So the ideas of the state are very left-wing from that French Revolution time and from Rousseau's writing. And I think we can tie that back to being, that's left-wing, because look at what they say about human nature. Look at what they say about man's relationship to other humans within this civil society, where you have to bring yourself into this massive state. They're not ascribing this to evil or nefarious reasons, but they're thinking that this is where you reach your maximum flourishing. And oftentimes we hear this from the communists, even the anarcho-communists, who say we have to come together. We have to get rid of these injustices. We come together. Workers unite as either syndicalists or in some kind of anarcho-communist society. And this is where we can find our maximum flourishing. And many of those on the libertarian left, I'll grant them this much, they're non-Marxists. They're non-Marxian views that they hold. Many of them, I think, even stemming from Proudhon and others, Bakunin. Some of them didn't even believe in the labor theory of value. They thought that Rousseau was a reactionary. They thought even that Marx was a bit of a reactionary extent as well. So that's an interesting distinction when you get into kind of anarcho-socialism, anarcho-communism, and when they look back to Rousseau and the Bolsheviks and whatnot.
Yeah. Let me ask you this one. So you had, in the beginning we talked about how a lot of libertarians want to be above the fray and say, oh, there's this left-right spectrum, but libertarianism isn't on there. What do you think though about? Because I think what they're recoiling against, and I certainly used to do this as well until then, like I say, I realized, no, but there really is something to this left-right thing, is when you'll see things, when people will say, oh yeah, like the far left is Joseph Stalin is, pure communism. The far right is either fascism or Nazism and, Adolf Hitler. And then, reasonable people are in between those two things, and you can put Mitt Romney somewhere and you can put Nancy Pelosi. And so clearly.
So Mitt Romney is a libertarian.
Exactly. Or he's more libertarian than Hitler. Yeah. So,
right.
So I think it's that kind of mentality that the libertarians who say, oh, we reject this left-right spectrum thing are trying to, because if that's the deal, if, the far left is Stalin and the far right is Hitler, that sort of builds in statism as the natural, subtext there.
Sure. Well, is it more of a spectrum or perhaps it's poles? And I realize that certain people are going to have different views. I'm not here trying to say you're a conservative in every way. You're a so-called liberal, or you're a righty or lefty, and that means that's your tribe. And people have deviations. People have different thoughts. Of course, they're all individuals, right? But this idea of centrism too, I find it irritating. This is where I love, Ayn Rand has some great quote about those in the center or whatnot, and I won't try to quote it here. I'd butcher it, but it's typical Ayn Rand, right? You can see her kind of saying this with an angry scowl or whatever. But those in the center, essentially, that's a non-ideology. That just means you're kind of like capping out or saying, I want to average this bad out and that bad out, and here's where I'm at. I'm just in the middle. Centrism itself is like an anti-ideology, and that's not what libertarianism is by any stretch. Libertarianism is these are very important ideas, and I think they're very useful ideas about limiting or in some cases abolishing the government, certainly, and then not aggressing upon the rights of other people. That's very important. That's very useful as a political principle. But again, when you get down to the individuals within libertarianism, I think human beings just tend to have this natural affinity toward hierarchy or toward egalitarianism. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. I was just trying to kind of comment in the article as far as this is kind of how I see it. This is what I see. But that doesn't mean there's any requirement for libertarians to say, I'm in this camp, like right libertarianism incorporated or left libertarianism.
Right.
But we see it. I mean, we see it with Ron Paul supporters and the paleo-libertarians of yesterday and kind of some of them today. A lot of anarcho-capitalists, as I mentioned. Many of them are going to be more on the right because to really defend private property, where do those rights come from? If private property is just granted by a bunch of people in some assembly or in some government building, well, then it means nothing. It's just open to being overturned at the next revolution, the next war. So to really be a propertarian, or, many of the great Ron Paul supporters, and of course, a lot of ANCAPs, many of them, when they dig down, they're going to find that this absolute right to private property and hence free association and protecting your own body and your person and your land, where does that come from? Where do you get that right? And we can say, well, it's just inherited. I don't know where it comes from, almost like kind of like a Bertrand Russell explanation for how the universe came about or something. It's like, we don't know. It's just here. It just is. Okay, that's fine. And I have a lot of friends and much respect for the Burkeans, certainly. But at the end of the day, to really defend private property, where do those rights come from? They have to be innate. Just like if you crash on some deserted island in the middle of the Pacific, you have the right to go out and acquire property, to mix your labor with the land, to collect coconuts, to build a little lean-to or shed. You don't have to ask for that right. That is innate. Right? That's an inborn human right. That's what I argue. It's a natural right.
Yeah. And it's so I agree with that. And what's interesting too is I was just looking up to see if I could get a good example. So folks, again, I'll put these links at bobmurphyshow.com/159. I'm sure you've seen, Greg, where instead of just having the left-right spectrum, it's a 2D, political map or compass or spectrum. I guess it'd be spectra. And where they'll have like, left versus right, in terms of the x-axis, but then the y-axis, the top is like authoritarian and the bottom is libertarian. And so the idea being that, you can, so what's interesting, and I imagine if the people who say, we're above the left, right, we're libertarians, that's probably, and this idea that it's either the far left is communism and the far right is Hitler, and they think that that's wrong, and they would probably endorse that 2D thing. But even there, that 2D compass isn't saying there's no such thing as left versus right. It's just saying that's not the only information you would need about somebody.
Yes, right. And you could plot it into a 3D compass or I guess 4D, MAGA chessboard if you wanted to or whatnot. But I guess this is the part of the discussion where we need to cue the BoomerCon comment. Well, Hitler was a socialist,
Right.
And that's absolutely true. Mussolini, when he was younger, was a socialist. And then they just kind of deviated out and wanted more state control of industry, and they mixed in nationalism and whatnot. And of course, we can mention all that, and that's true. So to put Hitler on the right, I guess people do that just because there's some kind of nationalistic element to that. A lot of that was smearing. The fascist smear came from international communists, international Marxists and workers of the world, and they wanted to distance themselves from people whose economic views really were not that different. I mean, they were all against capitalist exploitation of the worker, and they all wanted these wonderful progressive sounding plans, for healthcare and shortening the work week and banding together in unions or trade associations or what have you. The economic views they're coming out of the same tree. Then they just branch off a little bit in terms of, do we want an international revolution, which that kind of failed. That failed miserably, actually. And then, or do we want this more nationalistic, view of things? And in the case of the Nazis, it horrifically turned into being mixed with racism and was a disaster ending in genocide, of course. Injustice all around.
Yeah. Have you said something a minute ago about polls, and I'm wondering are you familiar with Tom Woods's, because there's an episode, I don't remember off the top of my head. I'll go find it, folks, though, and link to it, where he has Paul Gottfried on, And Tom said, I've rethought this. He said, I no longer believe in the left-right spectrum. And he said, I believe that there's the left and the right, but what he was realizing he had been using without thinking it through was that term spectrum. And he was saying that's the problem. That he's saying, no, you're on the left or you're on the right, but there's not a spectrum. In other words, it's not that there's a bunch of people halfway in between them, that you're basically one or the other, or that's a useful dichotomy to sort people by.
Okay, yeah, I should credit Paul. I've read his book, The Conservative Movement, which is fascinating.
Sorry, Tom was saying that to
that
Paul.
Was Tom.
And then Paul agreed. Like, say, yeah, but it was Tom was the one who brought that up to saying, I've been rethinking and,
I think I would generally agree with that. I mean, there's certainly deviations, of course, but to have this beautiful, nice, oversimplified spectrum,
right?
And we can use it as a heuristic, or a little bit of just, it's a tool. But I think nowadays it's kind of more like, well, are you more on this pole or are you more toward that pole? Again, centrism is nothing. Centrism is Mitt Romney slightly over the line and Hillary Clinton. Or I think it's Tom Woods that has a great line that no matter what you do, who you vote for, you always end up with John McCain, and that's right in the middle. It's like a lack of ideology to a certain extent. The other thing I might add, Bob, is that I didn't go here with the article or whatever because I didn't want to be advocating necessarily. But I think with a lot of the frustrations that I've been seeing with the current Libertarian Party, that might stem from, in part, and not everyone's going to like this, but I think the Libertarian Party is missing an opportunity to grow itself because they're kind of playing 50 over here, 50 over there, or six on one hand, half a dozen on the other with this, trying to pretend they're the centrist or third leg of the stool. I think libertarians need to be realistic about who their natural allies are in capital L libertarians. They need to look at who has had the most success in growing this movement, who's brought in the most converts, and where did those converts come from? I would argue, and I think many would argue, that it's been Ron Paul. I mean, today, 12 years beyond the 2008 movement really got cranked up with that presidential election, many people are still saying, I came into this movement because Ron Paul and his message and whatnot. Many of those people did. And I always liked Ron Paul. It took me a little bit longer on the interventionism, interventionism abroad and whatnot. But if you look at who's really had success in growing the liberty movement, it's Ron Paul mixing over or crossing over with the Tea Party and bringing in conservatives. Because I'd argue that every conservative, almost every conservative, really before the Trump movement, but every conservative is a total capitalist or claims to love the free market. And I really believe that they do love the free market, even though that's not always realized. And every conservative believes in small government and individual rights. But when you take those to their logical extent, those conservatives are going to end up more as libertarians. So I think there's a natural allyship there that is not being exploited at all. And exploited's maybe a bad word. It's a bad way to put it, but maybe taken advantage of and really used to grow the movement. I think a lot of times libertarians say, oh, yeah, those troglodytes, they're just Republicans or conservatives or, boomer cons and this and that. That's fine. We can all rib each other a little bit in jest. But if we're actually serious about having some success and not just having these silly conventions where there are naked guys running around and people are wearing weird costumes and, we become a parody. Many libertarians are a parody of themselves. I think they need to look at pragmatic solutions. How do you grow the movement? And we need to bring on board and welcome on board people from the right, certainly Tea Party conservatives, small government conservatives, and look at people like Mike Lee and of course even Rand Paul or other supporters even of Ted Cruz. You bring them in and have a coalition. That's what I'd argue for, at least from a practical perspective. And I think sometimes there's too much of this sitting on either sides of the fence and, almost wanting to be these good little social justice warriors or whatever. We're the Committee on Public Safety, sitting over here, looking at the riots, the racial unrest and everything that's been going on. And I think that's not helpful to pretend, we like some of their ideas, we like some of these ideas, and to kind of play it right down the middle. It'll be 3%, 4% of the total vote for years and years, unless there's a better strategy that's developed. That's what I'd kind of argue for, making more overtures and reaching out more to certain groups that are open to the message, to the liberty message.
I think having a disdain for naked guys running around the party's convention is a very right-wing comment from you.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so intolerant or whatnot.
I mean, I'm saying that partly to be funny, but also that is a good example. You know what I mean? Like, do you think that's a good look or not? And people are like, no, it's funny, haha. And if you're uptight about that, then we don't want you anyway. Like a left libertarian would say that. You know, that's
yes,
funny.
Fair enough. You know, guilty as charged.
By the way, I had earlier said you want to go, but can I keep you another 20 minutes? Is that all right with your schedule?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. Because
I still
had other
as
stuff.
long as my internet connection hangs in there, I'm good.
Okay, great. By the way, just for the listeners who don't, they probably picked it up, but when Greg's saying capital L versus small l, the capital L means Libertarian Party, and small l just means like the philosophy. Have you heard Greg Michael Malus's? I think I'm getting this right, where he'll say his test for whether you're left wing or right wing. I think it goes something like
I have
asks. So I'll say what I think I remember it being, and then you tell me if I'm getting it wrong. He'll say to someone, is the test, ask the person, are some people better than others? If the person says yes, they're right wing. If they give you a speech, then they're left wing.
Yes, I've heard some formulation of that. Listening to Michael Malus, absolutely.
Okay, so do you like that? Does that line up with what you were saying about the hierarchy, or do you think that that's too glib? Or I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Sure. No, and I think Michael Malus is hilarious and very entertaining. And I think it's maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, but probably effective. So, what would probably happen is someone on the right would say, yes, let me tell you why. And I don't think that would be the speech maybe that Michael was referring to. But yeah, I would agree. When you ask that question, you are going to get this long speech, and it's not an elevator speech from someone who's more coming from the left or a social justice warrior or whatnot. I think that's a helpful tool. Yeah.
Okay. So I've been thinking about that a lot, and that's why I thought this would be a good, to bring it up in the context of your article on this stuff. I'm not sure how because I agree with you that yes, there's natural hierarchies, and the people on the right agree with that. And Jordan Peterson does a great job with that, where, people will complain about, white supremacy or this or the patriarchy and whatever. And Peterson will say, obviously I'm putting words in his mouth and he says it more eloquent, but like what they've identified is that there are hierarchies, and yes, there are, but that's not the same thing as establishing that there's, injustice out there, that, this is a, normal thing. And he famously looks at lobsters and whatever, and people think that's goofy.
And crustacean communities.
Yes,
right.
Yeah. Right. And to get there. And so clearly, yeah, I mean, among, mathematicians, there's a hierarchy, and we can't even, you and I can't tell the difference between the 10th best mathematician in the world and the 100th best, but they can. Those mathematicians can know who the different, how to sort them and so on.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that's in any field. But my concern with Malus's framing and the reason, so if he asked me, I would give him a speech and he'd say, aha, you're a left winger. And I would say, no, that's just showing your quiz doesn't work. And he would say, no, it always works. And it's never been wrong. And he's just asserting that. But because as a Christian, I would say, well, what do you mean? So different people are better at certain things. So yeah, that guy's better at math. This person's a better chess player. Dave Smith is a better comedian than me. I'm a better economist than he is. Is he a better? And so ultimately I was pushing it through and saying, well, the only non-arbitrary criterion is to say in the eyes of God, at which point I would say, no, I'm not better than anybody else. And what was interesting is when Tom Woods had Paul Gottfried on and they brought up Malus's thing, they both agreed with it. And Gottfried sort of as an offhand said, I mean, except maybe in terms of a Christian perspective, in the eyes of God or something. And I would say, but as a Christian, isn't that the most important stance? You know what I mean? In other words, the most important lens through which to judge this. So anyway, I'm not really coming down one way, but those are some of the things that when I consider what his little thought experiment.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I think that's really where equality comes from, at least in my opinion. It's, again, natural rights coming through from a creator, from God. If that's not the source of equality, or if that's not how things actually work in the universe, why equality then? This is what I always ask the left, so I have to live under some, communist dictatorship? I have to live under your state, Rousseau, or whatever you're trying to get me to go into? Why? Just because it's a consensus? No, I don't sign the contract. I'm not in on your consensus. Tell me why I have to believe this. Why is everyone equal? well, everyone's equal in the eyes of God, because Christians and many believing people would believe that mankind was created in God's image and likeness. Without that, where's the equality? There's the drive to force equality, and that's where some of the worst schemes that mankind has ever devised have come about. We're gonna take money from these people, those farmers. You got to go take it back from them, the land, and do this and that. All these communistic schemes and socialistic schemes with forced equality have led to some terrible genocides and injustices and whatnot, and as you know all too well, certainly. So I like Malus's that little heuristic. Maybe it's a little bit tongue in cheek, and I can definitely say, yes, some people are better than others, knowing in my mind, I'm not going to give them a speech, but it's, at basketball, or at this, or with innate abilities, or whatever it might be. Some people are more virtuous than others. I mean, you can tie this back to even virtue ethics and whatnot, going back to Aristotle, Nicomachean ethics and whatnot. It's what muscles do you choose to flex? Acting virtuously, that's like flexing a muscle. For sure.
Right.
And some people are better at that than others. But as a Christian, I do believe, all people are created in the image and likeness of God. And that's a source of equality right there. Beyond that, I want equality under the law, because I don't want the law to favor one group over another. As really someone who's probably qualified as a minarchist, I want a very, very small state, a night watchman state, to take care of X, Y, and Z. But nothing else other than X, Y, and Z. That's where civil society comes in.
And it's really important, too, to specify it that way, because, like, your views on what type of equality is important, like, equality before the law. Like, oh, you get accused of a crime, no, you're going to, you have the right to counsel and so forth. You should have a defense. Even though we saw him do it on tape. Everybody, the whole community would swear up and down, this guy's guilty. I don't care. He gets a trial. And, so why? And it's because of his dignity as a human being, not because we looked over the course of his life and he did enough good acts, so he warrants getting a lawyer. It's just like, no, because he's a human, period, you have certain, God-given rights, you and I would say. So it's interesting and by the way, let me just cover myself in case some Protestants out there are objecting. Even if you want to say, no, some people are better than others because some are saved and some are damned in your framework. Okay, but that's still not by their own merit. Even according to them, they would say, God
under
just,
Calvinist
for his own
principles.
So it's still, it's still not like what Dave Smith and Michael Malus mean when they say, some people clearly are better than others. What are you talking about? And we're right wingers and we acknowledge that.
Right. And equality goes both ways too. Let me just jump in on that. Even like the terrible injustice that happened to George Floyd, as someone who's maybe of lesser means, I don't know his exact economic situation, but if that were some rich guy or whatever, if that were Bill Gates, God forbid, or whoever that got, pulled out of his car and that happened, whatever it was that happened, but if that occurred, it would also be an injustice, and so it's that level of equality.
Right.
It's not just for, well, this is an underrepresented group or this is an oppressed or marginalized group. It doesn't matter if they're marginalized or not. It's literally, what are the facts before the law? And I think that's what you and I, it sounds like, would agree on. Yeah. That's true equality. It goes both ways.
On that, I remember I saw a headline several months ago saying, like, men are more likely to die from coronavirus, and this is really hitting their widows hard, or something like the story was these poor women who have to deal with their husbands dying. And it was like, well, wouldn't it? If it were the other way around, I'm pretty sure they would say it's hitting them. That's kind of funny.
Because men are more prone to not wear masks. I'm sure they could turn it around and vilify them somehow.
Let's see. The other irony too with all that stuff is, even though ostensibly, a standard leftist, and I don't mean left libertarian, but just in general, someone from the left would probably say, oh, we believe in equality, whereas you people on the right, you're bigots. But in practice, in terms of, like you're saying, like, oh, there's a procedural hearing to see, is like you say, like, did something unjust happen here? You and I wouldn't care about the racial identity of the individual. We would just say, no, they're in period. So there's a sense in which actually we are much more for equality in certain circumstances, whereas they would say, did this person cheat or whatever? Well, like someone cheats on the SAT to get into college or something. I think a lot on the left, it would, if it were coming from a disadvantaged group, they'd say, well, they kind of, let's excuse that because look at their background. That's what they had to do to get into the college to beat this system. You know what I mean? they wouldn't treat people the same. It would depend on, the rules would vary depending on their skin color or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, and I look at the recent examples of police brutality, which I try to look at, on a case-by-case basis, looking at all the facts and whatnot. But I think it was Eric July, I want to credit him for saying this. What it's more fundamentally about, it's about the statism, not necessarily the racism. To prove the racism or whatnot, you really have to go much farther out on a limb, and you've got to go prove intent and all this stuff. Why don't we strip it down, kind of like what you were talking to, at a very basic level? We're all equal. All human beings are supposed to be equal before the law, and that maybe what happened to Breonna Taylor getting shot in her own home, for example, we might oppose that because she's a human being. Has nothing to do with the fact that she's African American or what was her job, or did she have an ex-boyfriend who was, allegedly a drug trafficker or what. That might be true, all the drug stuff. But at the end of the day, being unarmed and shot in your home at 12:45 at night is not good, no matter what color you are, no matter what your background is.
Right.
That's true equality in my mind. Equality of all human beings before the law.
Right. And I had this guy Adrian Lee Oliver on, Greg, and I'll put that, folks, in case you missed that one. He was making. A lot of people have made this point too, but saying that it's in his experience. So he is a black guy who directly experienced, police brutality directed at him.
Okay.
So he knows what he's talking. But his point was, he's saying, no, the police, like, they'll beat up people in, like trailer park community, white people in trailer park community. It's more of a power imbalance.
Sure.
It's it's not a matter of all the police are racist. It's that police can abuse their power when they can get away with it, and statistically that might disproportionately impact certain communities. Yeah.
Too often we funded all this militarization of the police and whatnot. And I know this is where a lot of law and order conservatives, have maybe good intentions, and they want the police protected. Well, okay, at the end of the day, we have summer 2020 to contend with. So the police have been militarized with all this gear, all this funding and whatnot, all this military surplus equipment for, 10, 20 years, decades. So what happens then? The first time they really need to use all of that equipment on a mass scale, we see cities burned down by modern Jacobins and nut jobs with purple hair, trashing cities, assaulting innocent people. And that infuriates people. Particularly, I've seen right-wingers come out and a lot of right libertarians saying, no, this is not okay. I don't want to see this, the riots are the language of the oppressed or the unheard. What's happening is targeting private property. It's terrorizing innocent civilians and whatnot. And all this was going on in summer of 2020. Seattle, Minneapolis, Portland, and on and on and on. All the major cities practically in the United States. Where was all this military surplus equipment? What was it used for? If not the summer of 2020, what's it for? That's what a lot of people want to know. Civil libertarians and folks on the right and left, I hope, would be saying, you know what? Why don't you give it back to the military? Why don't we sell it on the private market? Because you don't need to have it. If you can't protect a man like David Dorn in that tragic video that many of us have seen, or a Target, or someone's individual shop, if you can't stop fires in the streets and murder and mayhem, well, then you know what? I don't know what you have all this military gear for. Give it back. What's it there for?
At least they could sell it to warlords in Somalia, get some money from that. Yeah,
come on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that point. That's a good one, Greg. That what are they? When, if not then, when would they use it? If I could keep you just for a little bit more here, this last topic I wanted to bring up was this issue of thick versus thin libertarianism.
Sure.
So let me just read a little bit of your article and then have you comment. So you say, in many instances, the line between left libertarians and right libertarians roughly approximates the delineation between thick and thin libertarianism. Thin libertarians merely believe in the NAP, again, folks, that's the non-aggression principle, the inviolability of private property, and the illegitimacy of state violence. Under subsidiary principles, any government that is allowed to exist has its relatively small, distinct sphere of influence, and it must not intrude upon local communities, and especially not the family. Thick libertarians usually go much further, though. As Lew Rockwell has argued, and so now you're quoting, this is Lew Rockwell, and I'll just read a few of his lines and then I'll turn it over to you. Proponents of a thick libertarianism suggest that libertarians are bound to defend something more than the non-aggression principle, and that libertarianism involves commitments beyond just this. One such proponent recently said, "I continue to have trouble believing that the libertarian philosophy is concerned only with the proper and improper uses of force." Okay, so, and I guess just one last comment coming from me now is I've seen, just so the listener, in case they haven't heard these terms, some people, and they tend to be left libertarians, will say things like, it's not enough just to be for the non-aggression principle or against the initiation of force and fraud. You know, to really be a full-fledged proponent of liberty, you also have to be very much against racism or, you know, things along those lines, so that, you know, there's other things that are connected to it. And that's the sort of thing the so-called thin libertarians are recoiling against. Like, no, libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, period.
Sure. And I think Lou Rockwell is the biggest proponent of the thinnest libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Hoppe also as well. From what I understand out of reading Hoppe, I think he also is very open to cultural traditionalism, which I'm open to that as well. But I think when we strip things down, I go with the Rockwellian kind of definition, where the thin is just really minimizing or abolishing any kind of state violence and abiding by the non-aggression principle. And of course, I'm a propertarian, so I strongly believe in absolutely inviolable property rights, just as a sine qua non there. But I think what happens too is we get these social movements that get infused and picked up and absorbed into libertarianism. Like, so say of the past 12 years, gay marriage nationally, which of course should be a local or state by state issue. It's turned into a national thing with the Supreme Court decision and whatnot. But when you talk to a lot of libertarians, and perhaps some, I might have heard some of maybe the Reason crowd, Reason Magazine, and some others whom I have a lot of respect for, but when people say, well, of course we have to be for gay marriage. I mean, how could the state discriminate against gay people? Well, I think a lot of people who are thin libertarians would say, whoa, put on the brakes there. When did we as libertarians start saying that the state should have any role in marriage licenses? And you want to talk about going back to the progressive era or scientism, there are all sorts of creepy reasons that there are marriage licenses. So that's a whole other topic, licenses and what have you. But when we say things like that, you know, get into topics like gay marriage, or when we get into these kind of social justice or racial justice issues, if we make them about more than just property rights or non-aggression, then you get into some really dicey territory. And almost by definition, Bob, they're calling in a spot or a role for the state as the referee. When you get beyond just that, okay, these are contract rights, these are property rights. I don't want my body violated. I don't want my store burned down. Again, when you get beyond that, you're getting into some places where there has to be positive law. There's got to be this role for a state to intervene and, like I say, be the referee or the ultimate arbiter of what is good and what's not good. Mm-hmm. And then as a constitutionalist, as a constitutional minarchist, then I see the perversion of our Jeffersonian republic, you know, and we have the Supreme Court essentially making law. And that's an interesting and a very important topic as well, at least for minarchists from that point of view, when we talk about the Constitution.
Okay, so here's the tension I see, or just the issue I'm having when I was wrestling with these things. And again, that's why I said this is one of the things when your article hit the thick versus thin, because, you know, I've read the thick versus thin debates, and I'm definitely on the side of the thin libertarians, and I totally get it there. And then I also, for the people saying, no, let's not kid ourselves, there really is a left-right divide even among self-identified libertarians, and I'm on the side of the people who think that is a useful dichotomy, and I happen to be on the right as well, so I identify with them. But are we contradicting ourselves? That's what I'm saying. Like, on the one hand, doesn't it at least superficially sound like we're saying, no, libertarianism, it's just the NIP, period. Don't try to link a bunch of other stuff to it. But then in a different conversation, it's like, oh, it's not enough just to be against the non-aggression principle. You also have to know people have natural rights, that they're not perfectible, that, you know, there is a God. You got to support the family. If you don't have those other things too, your so-called libertarian polity is going to fall apart if you just think it's all about drug use and, you know, getting to, polygamy and whatever. So do you see how there, at least it seems like we're thick on our issues? Or sure. Couldn't a critic say that?
And this is where we have to have the distinction, I think, Bob, between libertarianism as the overarching kind of umbrella philosophy, and then individual libertarians or right-wingers or left-wingers, you know, being kind of on the right or on the left, right? There's there's definitely that distinction. And at the base level, if you're a thin libertarian, you're saying you can have any personal views you want to. You can be culturally conservative, as I think both you and I probably are. We would agree on things. You can be culturally more permissive or whatnot, maybe more on the liberal end of things culturally. But at the end of the day, if we're looking at thin libertarianism, it's a very limited philosophy, and it's just about the non-aggression principle and limiting or abolishing the role of the state in life. And that entails, then the question is really, okay, then what fills the void? Because humans are going to mingle together. Humans are always acting, choosing, interacting with one another. How do we build the civil society there? And that's a fascinating question too with anarcho-capitalism. Who is in your anarcho-capitalist community? Who do you bring in there? And as I said, that's a great topic. But one of the questions is, one of the things we've been discussing is, where do these principles come from? Where do rights come from? So it's a great discussion that we're having, mentioning some of the kind of philosophy behind it or political philosophy, but I think it's not necessary. So I'd say it's really helpful to know where the ideas come from, but you can still be a thin libertarian and have no idea how you defend those ideas or the etymology and the genealogy of ideas, if you see what I'm saying. I think I'm working my way through trying to be intellectually consistent and understand where all the principles I believe in come from. But it's totally fine to just be a flat out thin libertarian and not really trace it back to, okay, what are the nature of rights? Why are all human beings equal in conditions? What is the role of civil society versus the government, or the general will, the body politic and whatnot? So I think what you and I are having a great discussion on is just understanding these principles and then being intellectually consistent. Instead of infusing and making a requirement that you've got to do X, Y, and Z to be a good right libertarian, with the trademark symbol or whatnot. I think it's just fascinating and important to understand where these ideas take their root.
How do you feel? As we're sitting here talking about it, I'm wondering if it's really nothing deeper than, yes, on the one hand, there's more to life than just the non-aggression principle, or as we said earlier, there's a lot more than just libertarianism as a political philosophy and a society. If you tell me, there's a society of 10 million people and they're all libertarian, that's not enough information. In fact, that's going to make me think, I don't know that I want to live there if it's today's libertarians.
It's probably too big, according to Montesquieu and Jefferson. But,
So that's not enough. That's, like you say, necessary but not sufficient for a vibrant, free society.
Sure.
But on the other hand, in terms of the thin versus thick libertarianism debate, I think the objection from the thin libertarians was more. So in other words, if somebody says, it's not enough just to be libertarian to be against the non-aggression principle, you also have to be, anti-racist. You have to be, you have to really want to go out and help people in the inner city or whatnot, and if you worry about the rights of shareholders or something, then that's the objection is not to say, you can't talk about other things if you're going to be a libertarian. The objection is just to say you're misusing the term libertarian. In other words, people are not going to understand what the philosophy is if you're using the term libertarian to, by definition, include the stuff you happen to think is important, that then no one knows what the word means anymore. And so so they're more just protecting the integrity of the terminology, I think, is like what Lou Rockwell and Hoppe and so on are doing in the thick versus thin debates.
Sure. And I think a lot of times too, there's confusion because there's that label, a lot of times self-appointed, of libertarian, but I'd argue that it's really helpful to have a modifier or an adjective there. And oftentimes libertarians too, this is why, in my view, in my analysis, they're so ill-equipped to handle many cultural issues, Bob. Like, you see, I enjoy watching Tucker Carlson, right? No libertarian at all. I don't agree with many or any of his economic views. I probably line up more with his commentary and analysis of the culture, and that's fine. But when he rails against China and of course big tech and whatnot, I agree. I fundamentally agree. However, there's a difference between, my thoughts of what does the government do? How do we apply law or treaties and tariffs and coercion on these big tech companies or or other countries, Chinese firms or Huawei or this or that, obviously Google, YouTube, Facebook, there are big problems. Many times when libertarians try to take this third stool or centrist position, they have absolutely no way to explain why is Google a problem. And if someone sits there today in 2020 and says Google and YouTube and Facebook, what they're doing with the election and everything across the board, storing all your information, cooperating with foreign governments like China, if a libertarian says, not my problem, we can't enforce laws or we can't do this or that, I think some of Tucker Carlson's critique maybe would be well merited at a certain point. I think libertarians are going to need to come up with answers to that. These are big problems. Now, we can say that the answer doesn't need to come from coercive government action or authoritarian government action, but this is what I'm saying. As individual libertarians, we need to decide how are we going to deal with this problem. And so libertarianism is very much overarching, but you get down to day-to-day life and problems in life, cultural problems. Google is a problem. How do you deal with that without enabling a massive authoritarian dictatorial government? But still, there's a question that needs to be answered there. And I think people like Tucker Carlson and some of the national conservatives who are very, kind of anti-libertarian, I think they raise important questions. They're having good discussions, and they're right in some of their critiques of libertarians to say, this is like tone deaf. There's like no response to this.
Right. I agree with you totally on that stuff. In particular, is really annoying. And Tom Woods complains about this all the time, where he'll, complain about, Twitter or Facebook or just deplatformed, or YouTube just deplatform someone, and look at how tame the guy's views were. This is crazy. Meanwhile, they let, this person over here talk about cutting off Trump's head or whatever, or wishing all men were dead, and that's fine. And then the left libertarians will needle Tom and be like, but it's private business, Tom. Can't they do whatever they want? And Tom's point is like, I can go and eat at a restaurant and leave a negative review that's not anti-libertarian. What are you talking about?
Right.
So
we can be against what Google does and their creepy censorship and all the evil that they do. We can totally be against that without saying, so I want some giant government to come down and crush them. There is a middle ground. I think it's not middle ground, but I think that these ideas that are not discussed should be discussed more by people in the liberty movement. Because there are real problems in life that maybe libertarianism itself cannot solve.
Right.
Civil society has to step in, or churches, small communities. Subsidiarity is very important. And I love some of what Jeff Deist and the Mises Institute people say. I fully agree with decentralizing power, localizing and privatizing things, because that's how we retain more control over our daily lives.
Yeah, and ironically, what we were just talking about there, it kind of goes back to, what I was trying to put my finger on, what's the difference between people on the right and the left, like procedural fairness versus outcome-based, that for us, like, for like a Tom Woods or somebody, or you or me, to complain about Google's doing something that we don't think is right, it didn't even occur to us to clarify. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, Mitch McConnell can come in and order a commission and oversee them and second get. Whereas to people on the left, since that kind of, what I mean, in their world, brushing with a broad stroke here. Yeah, when you see an injustice, boom, just look around. Is there any authority that has the enough guns to fix that? Well, then go do that. Of course you would. You know? So they assume that's what we mean, when in our mind is like, no, just because we don't like something doesn't mean we're therefore calling for the power of the state to come down on it.
Absolutely. That's right. Yeah, it goes back to that rule-based utilitarianism or deontological libertarianism, basically just saying, and I think you and I would ascribe the ultimate source to God or whatnot, but there's got to be rules that come down, whatever those rules are. And as you're saying, it's that abiding by these social or societal rules that's very important, instead of skipping those rules for a pragmatic kind of end result, just getting right to the end without don't worry about the means, because this revolution is going to happen, or this action is going to happen no matter what happens, no matter how many eggs we crack in the meantime to make this omelet. Right.
Okay, well, that's a good point to stop. Folks, my guest has been Gregory Gordon. Thanks, Greg, for the interesting discussion.
Yeah, it's been great. Really appreciate it, Bob. Thank you for having me.
And the last thing, folks, remember, go to bobmurphyshow.com/159 for the links of everything we talked about, and we'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.